It was a gloomy, rainy Tuesday morning in the middle of the city. The sky was filled with thick, gray clouds, and a cold wind was blowing through the tall buildings. In the heart of the financial district, inside the huge, glass lobby of the Sterling and Parker building, a man named Julian was pacing back and forth. Julian was not a patient man. He was the CEO of a rising tech company, and he was very proud of his success. He believed that because he worked hard and made a lot of money, he was better than everyone else. Julian was dressed in a very expensive, dark blue suit. It was made in Italy and cost more than what most people make in a year. He had perfectly polished leather shoes and a gold watch that shone under the lobby lights. He checked his watch for the 10th time in 1 minute and let out a loud, annoyed sigh. "Where is he?" Julian muttered to himself. Unbelievable. Julian was supposed to have a meeting with the board of directors of the Sterling and Parker Company. It was the most important meeting of his life. If things went well, his company was going to merge with theirs, and he would become incredibly powerful and wealthy. He usually traveled in a private car with a driver, but because of the heavy rain and terrible traffic, his car was stuck somewhere on the highway. He had to take a taxi to get there, and now he was standing in the lobby, waiting for his assistant to come down with his security pass. As Julian paced, he tried to stay clean. He hated the rain and he hated dirt. He kept brushing his sleeve with his hand, paranoid that a drop of water or a speck of dust might land on him. While he was obsessing over his appearance, he noticed someone sitting on a long wooden bench near the revolving doors. It was an older man. He looked like he was in his 70s. He had a long, white beard and messy gray hair. The man was wearing a dirty old coat that had holes in the elbows. His pants were torn at the bottom and his boots were covered in mud. He looked like he hadn't taken a shower in weeks. The old man was clutching a small bundle wrapped in a dirty cloth to his chest, holding it tightly as if it was the most precious thing in the world. Julian stopped pacing and stared at the man with a look of total disgust. He couldn't believe that someone looking so poor and messy was allowed inside such a fancy building. Julian walked a few steps away from the bench, holding his nose slightly. "Look at this," Julian whispered to himself, shaking his head. "They let anyone inside these days? It's ridiculous. This is a place for business, not for beggars." The old man didn't look up. He just sat there, staring down at the floor, shivering slightly from the cold air coming in from the doors. He looked tired and weak. Julian checked his phone. No messages. He was getting angrier by the second. The waiting was making his blood boil. He felt like he was too important to be kept waiting. He looked around the lobby and saw security guards standing by the elevators. He pointed an angry finger toward the old man on the bench. One of the security guards walked over to him. "Is there a problem, sir?" The guard asked politely. "Yes, there is a problem," Julian snapped, not trying to hide his arrogance. "Why is that man sitting there? He smells. He looks like he just crawled out of a dumpster. I'm trying to have a serious business meeting here, and I don't want to look at filth. Can't you throw him out?" The guard looked at the old man and then back at Julian. "Sir, he isn't hurting anyone. It's raining outside. He's just resting for a moment." "I don't care if he's resting," Julian said, his voice getting louder. "This is a private building. It ruins the image. Get rid of him." The guard looked uncomfortable. "We'll see what we can do, sir," he said and walked away. Julian huffed and turned his back on the scene. He walked toward the glass doors to look for his assistant outside. He couldn't understand why people were so lazy. In his mind, if someone was poor and on the street, it was their own fault. He believed that rich people were special and poor people were failures. He had no empathy in his heart. As he stood by the door, looking out at the rain-soaked street, he felt a sudden vibration in his pocket. It was a text message from his assistant. *him stuck in the elevator. "Coming down now." Julian groaned. "Great, just great." He started walking back toward the elevators to catch the assistant as soon as the doors opened. He was walking fast, his mind focused only on himself and his deal. He wasn't paying attention to where he was going. The old man on the bench had decided to stand up. Perhaps he felt unwelcome because of the way Julian was looking at him. Or maybe he was just trying to get warm. He slowly stood up, clutching his dirty bundle, and took a shaky step forward. The path between Julian and the elevators was narrow. Julian was walking with his head down, reading an email on his phone. The old man was looking at the floor, trying to keep his balance. They were on a collision course, and neither of them knew it. The tension in the air was rising. The people in the lobby were watching, sensing that something bad was about to happen. Julian was in his own world, a world where he was the king, and he was about to crash into reality. Julian was moving fast, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. He was reading a message about how much money he was going to make, and it made him feel powerful. In his mind, the lobby was just a space for him to walk through. He didn't see the other people around him as important. They were just obstacles in his way. The old man near the doors had decided to get up. He felt the cold stare of the security guards and the angry look from Julian, and he thought it was best to leave. He gathered his dirty coat around him and held the small, wrapped bundle tightly against his chest. It was the only thing he had left, and he protected it like a mother protects a baby. He took a shaky step forward, his old legs trembling slightly. Just as Julian turned a corner near the large marble pillars, the old man stepped into his path. It wasn't a hard crash, but it was enough to make everyone stop. Julian's expensive leather shoe stepped right onto the back of the old man's muddy boot. Julian stumbled forward, losing his balance for a second. He caught himself quickly, but the shock of it made him drop his phone onto the hard floor with a loud thud. For a second, the entire lobby went silent. The receptionist stopped typing. The security guards froze. Everyone looked over to see what happened. Julian stood up straight and looked down at his phone. The screen had a small crack in the corner. It was a tiny crack, but to Julian it was a disaster. Then he looked at his shoe. There was a smear of wet mud on the pristine leather. Finally, he looked up at the person who had caused this tragedy. The old man looked terrified. He had seen Julian's type before. He knew that look of arrogance and hatred. The old man stepped back, his hands shaking. "I am so sorry," the old man said softly. His voice was raspy and weak, like dry leaves blowing on the ground. "Please forgive me. I didn't see you coming. It was my fault." A normal person would have accepted the apology. They would have picked up their phone, realized the old man didn't mean it, and moved on. But Julian was not a normal person. He was a man full of anger and pride. The embarrassment of stumbling in front of so many people mixed with his hatred for the poor, and he exploded. "Sorry?" Julian yelled, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You think saying sorry fixes this? Look at my shoe? Look at my phone." The old man looked down at his own feet, which were dirty and wet. I don't have any money to pay for the cleaning," he whispered. "I don't want your money," Julian shouted, stepping closer to the old man, invading his personal space. "People like you make me sick. You come into these nice buildings, you act like you own the place, and you ruin everything for everyone else. You have no respect. You have no class." The old man tried to back away, but there was a pillar behind him. He was trapped. He clutched his bundle tighter to his chest, as if he was afraid Julian would try to take that too. "Please, sir," the old man pleaded, his eyes filling with tears. "I am just leaving. I will go." "Oh, now you want to leave?" Julian laughed mockingly. "You should have left before you dirtied this floor with your presence. You are like a rat. You scurry around, looking for food, making a mess everywhere you go. Why don't you go back to the gutter where you belong?" The words were cruel. The people in the lobby started to whisper among themselves. They felt bad for the old man, but no one dared to say anything to Julian. They knew who he was. They knew he had power. So they just watched in uncomfortable silence. Julian wasn't finished. He felt like he was teaching the old man a lesson. He looked at the dirty bundle the man was holding. "And what is that?" Julian asked, pointing a finger at the dirty cloth. "What are you hiding? Is it stolen? Did you steal something from the trash cans?" "No," the old man said, his voice shaking. It is mine. It is important." "Important?" Julian scoffed. Trash is not important. Just like you. He reached out and flicked the old man's shoulder with his finger, a gesture of pure disrespect. You are worthless. You are wasting the air you breathe. Do everyone a favor and disappear? The old man looked up then. For the first time, he looked Julian straight in the eyes. His eyes were sad, but they were also calm. There was a depth in them that Julian didn't notice because he was too busy being angry. You have a loud voice, young man, the old man said quietly. But you speak with a small heart. Julian's face turned red. How dare you speak to me like that? Do you know who I am? I know who you are, the old man replied. You are a man in a suit. But that is all. That made Julian even angrier. He opened his mouth to scream more insults, but just then the elevator bell dinged. The door slid open, and his assistant stepped out, looking panicked. Julian, the assistant called out. We have to go. The meeting is starting now. Julian took a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. He adjusted his jacket and smoothed his hair. He gave the old man one last look of pure hatred. Security! Julian yelled, turning away. Get this garbage out of here before I call the police. Julian marched toward the elevator, his head high. He felt like he had won. He felt like he had shown the old man who was boss. As he stepped into the elevator, he turned around and saw the security guard gently putting a hand on the old man's shoulder. The old man didn't look angry anymore. He just looked disappointed. The elevator doors closed, cutting off the view of the lobby. Julian was alone with his assistant. What happened out there? The assistant asked nervously. We heard you yelling. Nothing, Julian snapped, looking at his phone. Just a bum trying to ruin my morning. Some people are just born to be nothing, I guess. Julian put the cracked phone in his pocket. He didn't feel bad about what he said. In fact, he felt justified. He believed that because he had money and success, he had the right to treat anyone without it however he wanted. He checked his reflection in the shiny metal walls of the elevator. He fixed his tie. He looked perfect. Don't worry about it, Julian said, smoothing his expensive suit. Today is my day. I'm going to sign this deal, make millions, and never have to think about that dirty old man again. He's nothing, just a speck of dust. And I am the storm that blows him away. The elevator rose quickly, taking Julian higher up into the building, far away from the real world. He had no idea that the speck of dust he left downstairs was about to change his life forever. He was so confident in his power, but he was about to learn that money doesn't buy respect, and a suit doesn't make you a man. The elevator ride felt like it took forever, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. Julian stood in the corner, staring at the numbers light up as he went higher and higher. He was still fuming about the encounter in the lobby. His heart was beating fast, but not from fear, from anger. He kept replaying the moment the old man bumped into him. How dare he? Julian whispered to the empty elevator. He looked down at his shoe again. There was still a faint smudge of mud on the side. It made him feel unclean. He took out a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and bent down to aggressively scrub the leather. Disgusting, he muttered, rubbing the spot harder. People have no discipline, no control. They just move through life like animals, bumping into things, ruining property. And then they expect me to say, it's okay? It is not okay. His assistant stood quietly on the other side of the elevator, looking nervous. He could see that Julian was in a dangerous mood. He knew that when Julian got like this, nothing could calm him down. Sir, maybe just forget about it, the assistant suggested gently. We have a big meeting ahead. Focus on the deal. This is going to be a huge day for the company. Julian stood up straight and stuffed the dirty handkerchief back into his pocket. He looked at his reflection in the polished steel doors. He fixed his tie and took a deep breath. You are right, Julian said, his voice cold and sharp. I am not going to let a homeless person ruin my biggest day. He is irrelevant. He is literally nothing compared to me. Today, I am going to become a partner in this firm. I am going to be on top of the world. The elevator finally reached the top floor. The doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a hallway that was even more beautiful than the lobby. The floor was covered in thick, soft carpet that felt like walking on clouds. The walls were decorated with expensive art. Everything was quiet, elegant, and smelled of lemon polish. It was a world completely different from the rainy, dirty street outside. Julian stepped out, his confidence returning with every step. He walked with his chest puffed out, acting like he already owned the place. He walked past the reception desk and toward the big double doors at the end of the hall. This was the boardroom. The room where decisions worth billions of dollars were made. He pushed the doors open and walked inside. It was a massive room with a long table made of dark, shiny wood. There were 20 leather chairs around it, but only a few were occupied. At the far end of the table sat the senior partners of the company. They were older men with gray hair, dressed in expensive suits just like Julian's. They looked serious and important. Julian smiled. He felt like he belonged here. He walked toward the head of the table, but he noticed that the most important chair of all, the one at the very front, was empty. "Good morning, gentlemen," Julian said, putting on his best business smile. He reached out to shake hands with the men. They shook his hand, but their greetings were short. They seemed distracted. They kept looking at their watches and then glancing at the empty chair at the head of the table. "Where is Mr. Sterling?" Julian asked, trying to sound casual. Mr. Sterling was the name of the founder. He was a legend in the business world. He was the man Julian needed to impress. Julian had never met him in person. He had only talked to Mr. Sterling's lawyers. One of the older men looked up. "He is on his way. He had a small delay downstairs, but he will be here shortly." Julian nodded and sat down in a chair near the empty seat. He felt a rush of excitement. He was actually sitting at the table with the partners. He pulled out his documents, ready to present his plan. He checked his phone again, wiping the screen on his sleeve to remove a fingerprint. For 10 minutes, they sat in silence. Nobody really spoke. The atmosphere was heavy. Julian started to get impatient. He tapped his pen on the table. "If he is not here, we can start without him," Julian suggested boldly. "Time is money, after all. I can present my ideas to you, and you can fill him in later." The partners looked at each other. One of them cleared his throat. No, we must wait for him. He does not like us to start without him." Julian rolled his eyes internally but kept a smile on his face. He leaned back in his chair, trying to look relaxed, but his mind kept wandering back to the lobby. He felt a strange itch in his chest, a feeling that he couldn't explain. It was like a tiny voice in the back of his head telling him that something wasn't right. But he pushed the feeling away. He told himself he was being silly. He was Julian Vance, a winner. That old man in the lobby was just a loser. Winners don't worry about losers. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the room swung open. Everyone at the table instantly stood up. The energy in the room changed instantly. The partners looked nervous and attentive. Julian stood up too, smoothing his suit, ready to meet the billionaire. A young secretary walked in first. "Mr. Sterling is here," she announced. Julian watched the door, expecting to see a young, dynamic businessman. He expected someone aggressive, someone like himself. But the person who walked through the door was not what he expected. At first, Julian didn't recognize the man. The man was wearing a fresh, clean suit, but his face was old and lined with wrinkles. He had a long white beard. His eyes were a sharp, piercing blue. Julian stared at the man. His breath caught in his throat. His heart skipped a beat. He felt the blood drain from his face. He knew that face. He had just seen it 20 minutes ago. The man walking toward the head of the table was the same man he had yelled at in the lobby. It was the dirty old beggar he had insulted. The man he called trash. Mr. Sterling, the billionaire owner of the building and the most powerful investor in the city, walked slowly to his chair. He didn't look at Julian at first. He simply sat down, looking calm and majestic. He buttoned his jacket and looked around the table at his partners. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Sterling said. His voice was strong and clear, the same raspy voice that had apologized to Julian in the lobby. But now it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Good morning." Sir, all the partners said in unison. Julian stood frozen. He felt like his legs were made of lead. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His mind was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. It can't be, he thought. Asterisk, it's impossible. That man down there, he was dressed in rags. He looked like a beggar. He smelled. He couldn't be Mr. Sterling asterisk, but deep down Julian knew it was true. The features were the same. The eyes were the same. The only difference was the suit. Mr. Sterling looked around the table until his eyes finally landed on Julian. The old man paused. A small, knowing look appeared in his eyes. He didn't look surprised to see Julian. He didn't look shocked. He looked like a man who was watching a rat run through a maze. "Ah," Mr. Sterling said, pointing a finger at Julian. "You must be Mr. Vance, the man of the hour." Julian tried to speak, but his mouth was dry. Why, yes. Yes, sir. I am honored to meet you." Mr. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile a cat gives to a mouse just before it pounces. "Are you?" Mr. Sterling asked softly. "We shall see about that. I hear you had quite an eventful morning downstairs in my lobby." The room went deadly silent. The partners looked at Julian, confused. Julian's heart pounded against his ribs like a hammer. This was it. The ground was about to open up and swallow him whole. He realized in that terrifying moment that his arrogance had just cost him everything. The silence in the room was heavy, like a thick blanket that suffocated everyone. Julian stood there, his heart pounding so hard he could hear a ringing in his ears. He felt cold sweat forming on his forehead, threatening to drip down onto his perfectly shaped eyebrows. He looked around the table at the other partners. They were all staring at him, their expressions curious. They didn't know yet. They were just confused by Mr. Sterling's comment. Julian tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was full of sand. He forced a fake, nervous laugh. "Eventful?" "Well, yes, sir. The traffic was terrible because of the rain. And there was a small incident in the lobby. But I am here now, and I am ready to focus on business." Mr. Sterling didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just looked at Julian with those sharp blue eyes. It felt like the old man was looking right through Julian's skin. Staring straight into his soul, Mr. Sterling leaned forward, resting his elbows on the expensive wooden table. "A small incident," Mr. Sterling repeated slowly. "Is that what we call it these days? You see, I was in the lobby a few minutes ago. I was sitting on the bench, resting my legs." Julian froze. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to run. He wanted to turn around and sprint out of the room, take the elevator down, and disappear into the city. But he couldn't move. His feet felt like they were glued to the carpet. Mr. Sterling continued, his voice calm but terrifying. "I was dressed rather poorly, I admit. I was wearing some old clothes because I had been doing some volunteer work at the shelter nearby. I like to help out when I can. It keeps me humble." The partners around the table nodded slowly. They seemed impressed by their boss's kindness. Julian, however, felt like he was going to faint. "I bumped into a man," Mr. Sterling said, his eyes locking onto Julian's face and never letting go. "A younger man. Dressed very well, arrogant, he was shouting at me. He told me I was trash. He told me I was a rat. He told the security guards to throw me out because I was ruining the atmosphere of his building." The room went silent again. The partners turned their heads to look at Julian. Their expressions changed from confusion to shock. They started to put the pieces together. Julian was the only new person there. He was the one who had arrived late. He was the one known for his temper. Julian's face turned a bright, deep red. He felt the heat rising up his neck. "Sir, I didn't know it was you," Julian stammered. "I thought you were... you looked like..." "I looked like what?" Mr. Sterling interrupted him gently. "I looked like a human being who didn't have money." "Is that why it was okay to scream at me? Is that why you told me I was wasting air?" One of the older partners gasped. "Julian, is this true?" he asked, his voice full of disappointment. "Did you insult Mr. Sterling in the lobby?" Julian looked at the partner, panic flashing in his eyes. "It was a misunderstanding. He stepped on my shoe. My phone cracked. I was angry. I didn't know who he was." Mr. Sterling held up a hand to stop the partner from speaking. "It doesn't matter who I am," Mr. Sterling said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the entire room. "That is the lesson you are failing to learn. You think that if you knew I was a billionaire, you would have treated me with respect. But you should treat everyone with respect, Julian. The janitor, the beggar, the CEO, it doesn't matter. We are all people." Julian stood there, trembling. All his life he thought money was the only thing that mattered. He thought that if you had money, you were better than people who didn't. He was suddenly realizing how wrong he was. But it was too late. The realization came crashing down on him like a ton of bricks. Mr. Sterling reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was thick, high-quality paper. He placed it on the table in front of him and smoothed it out. "I have heard a lot about your company, Julian," Mr. Sterling said. "Your technology is good. Your numbers are impressive. That is why we were going to offer you this partnership." Julian felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe the money still mattered. Maybe the business was more important than feelings. "Yes, sir," Julian said quickly. "The technology is great. We can make a lot of profit together." Mr. Sterling looked down at the paper. "This is the contract," he said. "It is worth $500 million. It was going to be signed today." He picked up the paper. For a second, Julian thought he was going to hand it to him to sign. Julian reached out his hand, a greedy smile twitching on his lips, but instead of handing it over, Mr. Sterling tore the paper in half. Rip. The sound was loud and sharp in the quiet room. Julian's hand stopped in midair. His jaw dropped open. Mr. Sterling tore the paper again. And again. He kept tearing until it was just a pile of confetti on the table. "I cannot do business with a man who has no heart," Mr. Sterling said, his voice finally showing a hint of anger. "Money can buy suits, Julian. It can buy watches and cars and buildings. But it cannot buy class. And it certainly cannot buy my respect." The partners watched in stunned silence. No one dared to speak. They watched the pieces of the $500 million contract scatter on the table. "You are a bully," Mr. Sterling said, looking Julian in the eye. "And I do not partner with bullies. You judged me by my rags. You didn't see the human being inside them. And because of that, you have lost everything." Julian looked at the torn paper. He felt sick to his stomach. $500 million, gone, just like that. Because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. Because he was cruel to an old man. "Please, sir," Julian begged, his voice cracking. "Please give me another chance. I can change. I'm sorry." Mr. Sterling shook his head slowly. "I saw who you really are when you thought no one was watching. That is the only time a person's true character shows. And yours is ugly." Mr. Sterling turned his gaze away from Julian and looked at his security guard standing by the door. "Please escort Mr. Vance out of the building. And make sure he doesn't come back." Julian stood there for a moment, completely broken. He looked around the room for support, but the partners wouldn't even look at him. They were all looking down at their papers or at the table. He was alone. Totally and completely alone. The security guard walked over and placed a firm hand on Julian's shoulder. "Come on, sir," the guard said. "It's time to go." Julian allowed himself to be turned toward the door. He felt like he was walking in a dream. This couldn't be happening. This was his big day. He was supposed to be celebrating. Instead, he was being thrown out like the trash he had accused the old man of being. As they walked out of the boardroom, Julian heard Mr. Sterling speaking behind him. "Now," Mr. Sterling said to the rest of the table, "let us discuss the other company. The one run by the young woman who volunteers at the shelter on weekends. She has respect." Julian walked down the long hallway, his footsteps echoing on the carpet. The sound was hollow and sad. The ride down in the elevator was the longest ride of his life. He watched the numbers go down, taking him further and further away from the success he had dreamed of. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, Julian stepped out. He walked slowly toward the exit. He saw the same marble lobby where he had stood just an hour ago, acting like the king of the world. Now, he felt smaller than the dirt on the floor. He pushed through the revolving doors and stepped out into the rain. It was still raining just as hard as before. The cold wind hit his face, mixing with the warm tears that were starting to run down his cheeks. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't have his car. He didn't have his deal. He looked down at his expensive Italian shoes, now muddy and wet from the puddles. He realized the old man was right. The suit didn't make him a man. And for the first time in his life, Julian felt truly poor. Julian stood on the sidewalk outside the massive glass building. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and relentless. He didn't move. He just stared at his reflection in the glass doors of the lobby he had been thrown out of. Inside, he could see people walking around, busy with their lives, holding cups of coffee and talking on phones. It felt like a different world, a world where he used to belong. A young couple walked out of the building, laughing under a large black umbrella. They didn't even look at Julian. To them, he was just another man in a suit standing in the rain. They didn't know that just 10 minutes ago, he was the CEO about to sign a deal worth $500 million. They didn't know that he had just lost everything because of his own arrogance. Julian took a deep breath. The air smelled of wet concrete and exhaust fumes. He looked down at his clothes. His expensive Italian suit was soaked through. The fabric felt heavy and clung to his skin. The jacket was losing its shape. The crisp white shirt underneath was turning gray from the splashing water. He looked at his shoes. The leather, which he had polished so carefully that morning, was covered in mud and water stains. He tried to wipe the water off his face, but his hand was shaking. He felt a cold shiver run down his spine, but it wasn't just from the rain. It was from the realization of what he had become. For years he thought that money protected him from problems. He thought that if he had enough money in the bank, he was safe. He was better than everyone else. But standing there in the downpour with no deal, no respect, and no future, he realized that money was just a shell. It could break easily. He remembered the look in Mr. Sterling's eyes when he tore up the contract. It wasn't an angry look. It was a look of pity. That was the worst part. The old man hadn't fought back. He hadn't screamed. He just watched Julian destroy himself with his own hate. Julian felt a burning shame in his chest that was hotter than the rain was cold. He reached into his pocket to take out his phone to call his driver. His fingers brushed against the screen. It was cracked, just like it was when he bumped into the old man. He stared at the crack. It felt like a symbol of his life. Perfect on the outside, but broken on the inside. He pulled the phone out, but his hand slipped. The phone fell from his wet fingers and landed with a splash in a deep puddle at his feet. Julian didn't pick it up immediately. He just looked at it lying there, half submerged in the dirty water. For a second, he thought about just leaving it there, walking away, starting over with nothing. But the habit of a lifetime was hard to break. He bent down and picked it up. The screen was dark. It wouldn't turn on. It was dead. He was truly alone. Julian began to walk. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to move. He walked past the expensive shops and the high-end restaurants. Usually he would walk into these places and the staff would greet him by name. They would give him the best table. They would treat him like a king. Now he was just a wet, messy stranger. He walked past a cafe where he used to have breakfast every Tuesday. Through the window, he saw the manager chatting with a customer. Julian stopped and looked in. The manager saw him, looked at his dripping wet suit and his defeated posture, and quickly looked away, pretending he hadn't seen him. The message was clear: "You are not welcome here." Julian kept walking. His legs were tired, but he didn't stop. He walked until the fancy buildings of the financial district started to change. The shops became smaller. The streets became dirtier. He found himself in a part of the city he usually tried to avoid. This was where the people he called rats lived. He saw a bus stop bench under a small shelter. He walked over to it and sat down. He put his head in his hands. The rain was still falling, but at least it wasn't hitting him directly. He sat there for a long time, watching the water run down the gutter. A few feet away from him, an old man was sitting on the ground. He had a cardboard box over his head to keep the rain off, and he was hugging a small bag of belongings. He wasn't asking for money. He was just trying to stay dry. Julian looked at the man. He saw the holes in the man's coat. He saw the mud on the man's boots. For the first time in his life, Julian didn't feel disgust. He didn't feel superiority. He didn't feel the urge to yell or call security. He felt a connection. He realized that right now, he was no different than this man. The suit he was wearing was just an expensive rag now. The money in his bank account was just numbers on a screen that he couldn't access to buy respect. Underneath the wet fabric, he was just a human being. Vulnerable, cold, rough day? A voice said. Julian looked up. It was the old man with the cardboard box. The man had pushed the box back and was looking at Julian. He had a kind face, weathered by the sun and the wind. He was missing a few teeth, but his smile was genuine. Julian was surprised that the man had spoken to him. Usually people ignored the homeless. But Julian realized that he looked homeless now too. "Yeah," Julian said softly. His voice was hoarse. "I made a mistake. A big one." The old man nodded. "We all make mistakes, brother. The trick is learning from them before it's too late." Julian looked at the muddy water on the ground. "I don't know if I can fix this one. I lost something very important today. I lost my pride." The old man chuckled softly. "Pride is a heavy thing to carry anyway. It's like carrying a rock in your pocket everywhere you go. Sometimes it's good to let it go. Makes walking easier." Julian sat there, letting those words sink in. He thought about how tired he always was, always trying to prove he was the best, always trying to be better than everyone else. He was exhausted. He had been running a race that nobody else was running, and he had tripped over his own ego. "Here," the old man said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly bruised apple. He handed it to Julian. "You look like you haven't eaten in a while. Take it." Julian stared at the apple. It was small and not perfect, but it was an offering of kindness. He reached out and took it. "Thank you," Julian whispered. He realized it was the first time he had said, "thank you," and actually meant it in years. He took a bite of the apple. It was crisp and sour. It tasted real. It tasted better than the expensive lunches he used to have at the top of the skyscraper. As he sat there, eating the apple in the rain with a stranger, Julian felt a strange sense of peace. He had lost the deal. He had lost his reputation. He had lost the fake respect of people who only cared about money. But sitting there, he felt like he had found something he had lost a long time ago, his humanity. He looked up at the sky. The rain was starting to slow down. The gray clouds were breaking apart, letting a tiny bit of sunlight shine through the city streets. Julian stood up. He was still wet. He was still cold. He still didn't have a job. But he stood up straight. He didn't puff out his chest like he used to. He just stood up as a man. He looked at the old man on the ground. "Is there anything I can do for you?" Julian asked. "Just keep going," the old man said, pulling the cardboard box back over his head. "Tomorrow is a new day." Julian nodded. "Yes, it is." He turned and began to walk. He didn't know where he would sleep tonight. He didn't know what he would do tomorrow. But he knew one thing for sure. He would never look at a man in rags and see a rat again. He would see a person. He would see a story, and as he walked away from the bus stop, leaving behind the ghost of the arrogant CEO he used to be, Julian finally felt free. The rain washed away the mask he had worn for so long, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to face the world as just a simple human being.